welcome everyone to the ATAR Notes July Ancient History Lecture. My name is James and I will be your lecturer for today. Just to give you guys a bit of background, ATAR Notes is a free resources platform. They provide a whole range of services, including, but not limited to, these lecture series, the ATAR Notes study notes, a newsletter, a whole range of YouTube videos that cover everything and every possible subject you could possibly be doing. They've also got a whole bunch of study resources on their platform ATAR Notes Plus, which is a subscription service, as well as their Smart tutoring service, which I'm one of the tutors, and I think it is quite worth it. The ATAR Notes study guides kind of got me through HSC. So, yes, it is that time of year now where you guys are all about to start trials, which is so fun, so fun. I feel for you all, I must admit. So trials time. It's always an interesting time of year. It'll really show how your preparation over the past 12-ish or 9-ish months has paid off. So, without further ado, my name is James again, and I will be with you guys for the next 2 hours. And just to preface, this is a recording, so throughout the airing of this lecture, there will be a live chat available. If anyone has any questions, feel free to drop them below, and I will be active, so I'll be able to answer them. Anyone watching after the fact, I hope I've answered all your questions, and if you do have any questions, feel free to get in touch with ATAR Notes, and we'll be able to give you a hand. Yes, so again, I'm James. I graduated last year in 2023 with an ATAR of 98.05. I studied Advanced English, Economics, Ancient History, of course, Legal Studies and Studies of Religion, so a very large mix of the humanities. I am currently studying a Bachelor of Laws in Economics at the University of Sydney, and as I've got the Hogwarts, it's sort of the reason I went, big Harry Potter nerd. And like I say there, I'm a big history nerd, so from a very young age, I loved ancient history, especially ancient Roman history. So I was very lucky when my teacher was deciding on our options and chose 3 Roman studies and 1 Greek study. So it was quite lucky. And again, I was that sort of kid in class where my classmates hated to have me there, but they needed me, so they loved it, because they needed me for notes. They needed me for the help, but they just didn't like the fact that I actually enjoyed what we were studying, and they dreaded it. They dreaded coming to ancient history. But I must admit, and I was very happy with my mark in ancient, and it is sort of based on the idea that it's easy to study for subjects that you enjoy. And of course, it's a bit late for you guys to get coughing that lecture about choosing subjects you enjoy, but you've got to find the joy. You've got to find the joy in studying all this stuff. Otherwise, HSC becomes a bit overwhelming. So, you guys are about to finish. Not long to go. Big congratulations. You've gone through the hard part. You've learned all your content. You've covered all you needed to cover. And now is the home stretch. Now, not long to go. Your trials and then your HSC exams. And then that feeling when you hear pens down on that final exam is the best feeling. It wasn't too long ago for me. About 6 months ago. No, longer than that now. Wow, I feel old. About 8 months ago or 9 months ago was my final HSC exam. It was the best feeling. Walking out, never having to walk back in, it was great. So, few things about prep for trials. And I know you guys would have heard this 1,000 times, but it is a marathon, not a sprint. Although your trials might be coming up, you still have plenty of time, and you have plenty of time before your HSC exams. I've heard lots of success stories of people really flopping their trial exams, but coming back and doing very, very well in their HSC. It doesn't define you. It's one exam. It's technically an internal assessment. So, with that in mind, try and do the best you can in your trials. Cover as much as you can, because think of the trials as literally trials for the HSC. They are a trial run. If you fail these, then that's fine, but you just know not to fail next time. If you don't do as well as you hope to do in these trials, that's the whole point of the trial. It's giving you a chance to practice the skills that we're going to go through today before the big exams. And for those of you who are lucky enough to have larger classes, remember it is a team sport as well. You need to keep in mind that you guys are all in this together. And within your respective classes and cohorts, the better you all do, the better you do individually leads to better outcomes for all of you. So scaling comes into play there, and everyone sort of boosts each other up. And now in a subject like ancient, which is notoriously like bad scaling, you need that as much as possible. So now we will cover 4 different skills in today's lecture. First one being using, analyzing, and studying sources. You guys would probably be sick to death of sources at this point. Source analysis, source A, source B, source C, sources in everything you do. Getting the comments and the feedback on your essays and your responses with source question mark. Everything we do in history, and specifically ancient history as well, like in particular, is source based. We can't make things up that happened 2,000 years ago, 3,000 years ago, 4,000 years ago, like you guys would have been studying over the past year or so. We don't know anything without those sources, without the records to prove it. So, second skill we're going to be looking at is short answer responses. These are often wasted marks. People, how do I phrase this? People lose marks too easily in short answer. Short answer is designed to be a very fast-paced section of the exam and a relatively easy compared to a 10-page essay. They're fast. We all have short attention spans, so it keeps us sort of moving. Then we're going to be moving on to extended responses and essays. You guys will obviously be so sick of extended responses by this point in your English essays and all the other humanities. So really nailing those essay skills, especially early on, is important because majority of your ancient history paper is essays. And unfortunately, ancient is not like it was pre-2017. We don't have multiple choice anymore, even though multiple choice were pretty awesome, I must admit. So then we're going to look at how to study for HSC ancient history. It's a mixed bag. Each person has their own methods, and by this time I'd expect that you guys have your own things, have your own methods down pat. But for those of you who are joining to sort of gain some insight into how to study, we'll look at that there. Now, I've got up the top there that this is a skills-based lecture, not a content summary. The thing with ancient is that for 3 of the 4 topics, it's list and case study based. So all of you guys do different studies. So you look into, yes, also, we've got the live chat. So anyone who's watching currently, while it's being live streamed on the 10th, put your questions down below and I'll be live to answer them. So yes, if you've come for content, don't worry. We've got the ATAR Notes study guide. We've got a whole range of resources available for you guys to catch up on content. And we will go through a little bit of the content today, mainly the core unit, as that is something that everyone studies. So it's only fair. It wouldn't really be fair of me to cover one specific study when some people don't study it. So that's section 1 of your paper. Core studies, cities of Vesuvius, Pompeii, and Herculaneum. Don't forget, it's not Pompeii or Herculaneum. Don't forget Herculaneum. So, your cities of Vesuvius study is something that the whole state participates in. Everyone doing ancient history sits this section. So when coming out of the HSC, you'll see a whole range of TikToks on those questions because you all sit it. Then is your ancient societies. I know a lot of schools study Spartan society, which is what I studied. And Spartan society is quite a good topic, I must admit. For an ancient Roman guy, I really did enjoy Sparta. Then you've got your personality study, which I studied Caesar. I know a lot of people do Agrippina. A lot of people do. I'm blanking on the other options, but Caesar was pretty awesome. And then you've got your historical periods. I know a lot of people do the Augustan age. My school chose the fall of the Roman Republic, which was quite cool. I must admit, it all sort of fit very well together. So, as I said earlier, half of the HSC for the ancient paper is extended response, and half of it's short answer. Doesn't leave much room for doesn't leave much room for our short TikTok minds, but our short attention spans. But if you master these two forms very early on, it'll make your life a whole lot easier. So, your core study, your cities of Vesuvius, Pompeii and Herculaneum, as you may know it by, is short answer. You will be provided sources for this section. So this is section 1 of your paper. You will be provided sources. So you'll get a source booklet along with the questions. And sometimes they will be archaeological sources. Sometimes they'll be written sources. Sometimes they will be modern, ancient. It can be a whole range of things. On your syllabus, you've got listed the whole range of sources that they could provide. So some people might see that as easy. They're giving me the sources. It makes my life a whole lot easier. Some people might see that as, oh no, I can't prepare prior. I have to think on the spot. Either way, we're going to cover how we're going to sort of interpret those sources and how we're going to apply those sources. Okay, there's a little trick to short answer questions, and it's really just the main idea is just getting to the point. Then, same thing with your society study, short answers. You find that in both of those sections, you'll get one larger question, as in an 8-marker, 7-marker sort of thing. And there are some trends in terms of what they ask with that section. Then you've got your section 3, which is your personalities. They usually break it down into a 10-marker and a 15-marker, both technically considered extended responses, mini essays. And then you've got your section 4, your period study, which is a full 25-mark essay. So, there's that question. How to survive ancient history. You guys have survived most of it. That's the answer. You've survived most of it. It's now about consolidating everything that you've covered. Staying on top of the content is that first point there. It's a very high content subject. So a lot of you throughout the year would have written notes, which is a very fair thing to do. I wrote notes. I think I spent too much time on notes. My notes were 50 pages long, unnecessarily. But it works for some of us. It's now at the point where you don't have much time to write notes anymore. Your exams are coming up, your trials are coming up. It's just about consolidating the content that you have learned and recognizing if there are any gaps in your knowledge. So, there's that point there about missing a lesson, asking your teacher. At this point, you should be backtracking just to make sure you don't have any gaps. Checking with your classmates if there is one particular section that you've missed, that they can fill it in for you. And then there's this idea of not leaving study to the last minute. We've always said this. It's been said to us 1,000 times. Will we listen? Who knows? Who knows? You have a little bit of time before your trials start. If I'm correct, you guys will all be on holidays at the moment. At the time of recording, I think you guys are still at school. But by the time you guys are watching this, I believe you'll be on holidays. Use your time wisely. It says there, do at least one essay paper per week. That's pretty fair. At this point during the HSC, I think I was doing a paper every day. And that's just not me trying to brag. I was sitting with a group of friends every day at the library. We were there together. It became our social outing. And we would go through a paper a day, depending on whichever subject it was, but we'd all choose a subject, we'd sit and we'd just do a paper. And whether that was finishing the whole paper in one sitting, practicing sitting for 3 hours, because 3 hours is a long time, or whether it's breaking it up, doing section by section. All right, guys, let's do the section 4 essay, and then we'll stop there. We'll read each other's essays, and then we'll come back to it, and we'll do a different section. I always loved answering the Sparta questions, your short answers, because you just get through them very quickly. It's not as heavy as an essay, sort of getting into the big tasks. So yes, get into the habit of trying to get through as many questions as you can. Best advice I can give is to break the paper up, look into the different sections as individual sort of things, and see how it'll work for you best. Because if you're good at sitting and finishing a task, get through the whole paper. If you need to break it up, do it. Now, the biggest and most important point, know your syllabus. This thing is a godsend. It's a list. It's a list of everything you need to know. They cannot ask you anything outside of that list. NESA, they like to make our lives difficult, but they're limited in their ability to do so. Everything listed on the syllabus is accessible. Anything beyond that is not. So you essentially have the list of things that they can ask you questions about. Know them. Know the list. You might not be an expert on every single syllabus point, but if you know where on the syllabus that question is referring to, whether let's say we're talking in Pompey and Herculaneum terms, it's a question in the reconstructing and conserving history part, you're able to take your contextual knowledge from those other syllabus points and apply it to that question. You may not be 100% on the mark, but you're still getting some marks. And then, yeah, practice, practice, practice. NESA, they're not infinitely creative. They cannot come up with a million questions that will each be entirely unique. The more practice questions you sit, and although the syllabus changed in 2017, the questions in the prior years are quite similar. So although you can't count on them as being entirely based on the current syllabus and don't use them as an accurate reflection of what your exam will look like, they are still good for practice. Now, speaking of the syllabus, this is what it looks like for your Pompey and Herculaneum, your core unit. It's split into 3 sections. You're investigating and interpreting the sources. The first one up there is the survey, and then you're reconstructing and conserving. Now, I mentioned earlier about some themes in those higher mark questions. With your Pompey and Herculaneum section, the higher mark, your 8 mark or 10 mark at the very max sort of questions, will always be taken from that reconstructing and conserving the past. I think it was one time in the past 10 years where it's been taken from that second section, investigating and interpreting. I think it was a question on the economy. But let's say you have an understanding of, on that economy point, you have an understanding of trade and commerce, but have no idea about the role of the forum. But you get a question on the role of the forum. You obviously know it has something to do with the economy. You're able to link it somehow to this overarching point of the economy. Again, knowing your syllabus really comes in clutch in these sort of situations because you know how to target your answer. For those people who are going to start, when asked about trade and commerce, are going to start talking about food and dining, clothing, health, baths, because, they relate to commerce in theory. Not on the syllabus. That's not what they're sort of asking. So if they're asking you a question about trade and commerce, they're wanting to know about the economy. Preferably trade and commerce specifically, but if you're able to draw some links to those other points in that overarching syllabus point, it makes your life quite a bit easier and it gives them less reason to take some marks away. Now, onto our first skill. All of that was sort of an overview of the course. You now know that it's 25 marks for each unit. You now know what you need to be looking for, what sort of questions you'll be getting, short answers and extended responses, no multiple choice here, unfortunately. And we're ready to get into the thick of it. So now we're going to start looking at using and analyzing and studying sources. Why are they important? Why we have to use them? We're going to look at some examples. I'm going to give you guys a few that I used to like to use. That were my cheat sources that I'd throw into as many questions as I could. And we'll go from there. All right. So, like I mentioned earlier, everything we know about history comes from sources. And these sources don't really mean much to us unless we interpret them. NESA is not going to give you sources that are already interpreted. they're not going to give you things and that will sort of give you the answer. The whole skill that they're assessing in ancient history is to see whether you can take some information out of these sources, tell me what is the source telling us, why is the source important, and a whole other range of different things. And there are lots of different factors that affect that. So sources don't speak for themselves. We need to interpret them. There is a need for analysis. This is very similar to English, where you can't write an essay about a text without referencing the text. You can't write an essay about a period in history, a person in history, a society in history, without giving me some textual evidence, some archaeological evidence, some artistic evidence. There's a whole range of different types of evidence that we can utilize, and funnily enough, they're actually listed on your Pompey and Herculaneum syllabus, because one of the things that they're assessing is the type of sources that you use and the range of sources that you're able to draw from. So this interpretation is the product of source analysis. So we get this interpretation from the source analysis that we are engaging with. So we can't take a source at face value. Lots of different things affect the usefulness of a source. Just because Pliny the Younger was alive and writing at the time of the eruption of Vesuvius, and he was or is sort of our main source for the actual eruption, does not mean we take everything he says as absolute objective truth. We need to investigate, we need to look into the reliability of what he's saying and have a deeper understanding as to what he means. So here, we need to access perspective and reliability. Perspective being a particular attitude or worldview regarding something. What are the different things that affect, in this instance, talk about Pliny the Younger, what are the things that affect Pliny the Younger's worldview? What are the things that make him talk about the things that he does, makes him relay the information that he's relaying in the way that he does? The next is reliability. The degree to which the source is accurate and trustworthy. So, a lot of you would have studied Pliny the Younger. Well, I'd hoped you'd study Pliny the Younger by this point when looking at the eruption of Vesuvius, not the Vesuption of Veruvius. You'd study his writing, and so his letters sort of show us the ancient perspective of the eruption as someone who saw it firsthand, reportedly. Yet something that is not immediately clear when reading his writing and reading his letters is his uncle was described as a hero, saving people off the beach in Herculaneum and rescuing the vulnerable and all these sort of virtuous characteristics that we would assign with a hero. And whether these things actually happened or not is up for debate. That's a question that we need to consider. Is it just the fact that it was his uncle that makes him relay that idea? Or was Pliny the Elder really saving people and helping everyone? They are questions that we need to consider. Or is it something that we're just going to decide that we're just going to take with a grain of salt? May or may not have happened. So analysing the above factors will affect not only how useful the source is, but what we actually use it for. We can draw on sources for a whole range of things to prove a whole range of different points. The question that we need to consider is what points are we trying to prove and what sources are we going to use for each of those points. Now, I mentioned earlier a whole range of factors that affect the reliability and the perspective of the source. There's your contextual factors: age, gender, nationality, religion, class, profession. And I just want to hone in on that point on class. My ancient history teacher, who, the all-time GOAT, he used to mention this quite a bit. All of the sources that we are reading, and I'm saying reading specifically because a lot of the written sources are the ones that I'm referring to. These written sources were not very often lower class, everyday individuals, the peasants. They were not the peasants. The peasants couldn't read or write. These were your upper class, very well educated, very well off individuals, and usually men. That is cutting the sample size of the population down from 100%, as everyone who can read and write, like let's say modern Australia, 99% of us read and write, wonderful, we're all literate. Back then, we're cut down to males, so let's say 50% of the population, educated, wealthy, influential males. That cuts us down not even to 1%. Our sources are limited, our written sources specifically are limited to 1% of the ancient population. Less than 1%. We have the smallest enclave of society that we're getting all our information from. Now, there's the question of whether we can trust the richest of the rich to try and explain what a day in the life is of a peasant, of a slave, of a bakery worker, of a fuller, as we look at in Pompeii, all these different sort of individuals. How is someone who's so well off, so well educated, in the upper classes of the Roman Senate, going to be able to tell us about their lives? These are things that we need to consider. Then there's this idea of like the political, or the purpose and motive. So these biases, the political agenda, the nationalism, patronage. And patronage is a particularly important one when we're looking at ancient Roman history. They had that patron-client relationship, that patron-client system, which was so integral to their society. Specifically when we're looking at Pompeii and Herculaneum, that patron-client relationship really led to a whole range of biases. Soon I'm going to bring up the picture of Marcus Nonius Balbus, their statue in Herculaneum. And he was of the senatorial class, and he was seen as a great benefactor of Herculaneum, and he had donated lots of money and dedicated public works and built XYZ. And he was depicted as some sort of idyllic figure. He was amazing, everyone looked up to him, he's great. Built statues in his honor, he's wearing military gear as if he's some sort of war hero, and all the rest of it. We've got to remember that the entire city of Herculaneum was a client of this Marcus Nonius Balbus guy. Not in a formal way, but he was a patron of the city. He would open games, he would be there, and he would be seen as that guy. That is something that influences the reliability of those sort of sources. And again, these aren't just written sources. That statue is a physical archaeological source. You've got nationalism, you've got political agendas. We're going to look at Aristotle. And Aristotle, the question of whether he's a misogynist or not, whether we can trust his sources and his writings about the role of women in ancient Sparta. Because he might have been a misogynist. Who knows? That's what we need to know. That's what we need to consider. And then you've got your structural factors, which are particularly important in this core unit, because we look at the process of archaeology. How are we reaching these new discoveries? The development of technology, the impact of these new technologies are the methods used by those who were first excavating the sites of Pompeii and Herculaneum. Do they take away from the reliability of that evidence? Whole range of things to consider. Now we've got this idea of factual reliability and then reliability as evidence. Factual reliability is something that we can say straight up. If a source is factually reliable, wonderful, it tells us a lot, we're able to tell the story very accurately. But again, the study of history here is not to tell stories. But the way we go about sort of validating these sources is corroborating with other facts, corroborating with other sources. If multiple different sources are aligning on a particular issue or a particular point, then it's likely that it may be reliable, or it's a real big conspiracy. Who knows? But these are things that we want to look at. These are like questions that we want to raise. If you've got multiple ancient historians saying a very similar sort of thing, and you've got lots of modern historians who are agreeing and concurring with that, well then factual reliability may not be a particular issue. The source might be factually reliable. But then its reliability as evidence is a whole separate idea. So I've got there that whether or not the content of the source, irrespective of its factual accuracy, can be used as evidence of attitudes. beliefs, and agendas at the time of those producing their source and their audience. So this is a big one that comes into play in that example of Aristotle. When he's talking about women and their role in ancient Spartan society, and specifically their role as landowners, can we still consider his writings a representation of his wider society, his perspectives? Because if he is saying these things and making these connotations and making these comments, can we think that what he has indicated is representative of the wider society? That the wider society viewed that the land ownership of women was not what it should have been. But we will get into that example, so I don't want to get too far into it. So the fact that a source is biased isn't always a bad thing. We can use that bias to still tell a story. Just because a source might not be factually reliable doesn't mean we don't use it in our responses. We are going to use it in our responses. We're going to make that bias very, very clear. Using one of those factually unreliable sources and not mentioning the bias probably isn't the greatest idea, because then you're quoting a factually unreliable source and not telling me that it's factually unreliable. Not the greatest idea. Even if you are using it and you're telling me it's factually unreliable, well, why are you using it? You've got to really explain it to the marker. Tell me why it's factually unreliable. Why are you still using it? Well, I'm using it because it indicates XYZ about XYZ. Weed it out. Make it very, very clear. Now, if we look at... finally, we've gotten to the example. Aristotle, a misogynist or just exaggerating, just hyperbolizing. So, he accounts that women owned 2/5 of the land in Sparta by the 5th century BCE. This is corroborated by other sources. It's corroborated by Xenophon. It's corroborated by a whole range of different sources. And I know I said we wouldn't delve too deep into the options for the different topics, and I apologize. But I know majority of people do Sparta. So for those of you who haven't studied Sparta, I do apologize. So it should be noted that he was a known misogynist. It's accepted right now that his sources are tainted by his misogyny, his writings. However, that wasn't too strange for the time. Although today that wouldn't be accepted, and his writings he would be ostracized. His writings would not be accepted. It's at that time it was relatively common, and Aristotle was an Athenian. He did not come from Sparta. Sparta, as we can tell from using this source, Sparta had a very different view on the role of women in their society. They had a different perspective. Women were seen in a different regard. It wasn't just that women were subservient to men. It's women played their own integral role in society, and the society wouldn't have functioned without women. It was very much built on this idea that a strong woman and a strong family bred strong children and a strong future, which is quite a different perspective to those of other Greek cities, and I've said they're Greek polis, the other sort of city-states. So while it was semi-factually unreliable, because he did exaggerate slightly, Xenophon did corroborate, but Xenophon didn't say exactly that it was 2/3. Aristotle was just trying to sort of make out, 2/3, that's crazy. Why do they own so much? This Spartan society, they're a bit shifty. They're not normal. It is to an extent factually unreliable, but it's still highly reliable as evidence. So for those of you studying Sparta, and you're asked a question about the role of women and what is the role of women, or contrast the role of women in Sparta compared to other Greek city-states, he is still a great source to use. He's a great source to use to contrast other sources. He's a great source to use to indicate the beliefs and thinkings of the period. Now, bias can be relatively difficult to understand. It is a particularly complex idea. I know all of you guys would have covered it from years 7 to 10, this idea of bias, and bias is bad. But that might not be very accurate. It might not be the best case scenario. So bias is an overused word. We have to try and sort of diversify our vocabulary here, especially when writing 100 marks worth of responses in an essay, in an exam. Um, we want to switch it up a little bit and use words that are a bit more accurate. So, in reality, all of us are biased. We all have inherent biases that affect everything. And just to say, or just to put the blanket statement that a source is biased, tells me nothing. If I'm the marker and I'm sitting and reading your response and seeing the idea that, okay, this source is not reliable because it is biased because of this, well, give me a bit more than that. What's the impact on that source? What is the source still useful? If the source is not still useful, why are you talking about it? Unless the question is saying, explain or discuss the reliability of this source, different story. But if it's a question asking you to use sources to achieve this point, why are you using sources that are not reliable or don't actually lead to the point you're trying to argue? It's just unnecessary. So bias is not synonymous. It's not the same. You can't use it in place of unreliable or useless. It's incorrect. It's very much incorrect. So bias isn't an inherently bad thing, and in some cases it can enhance the usefulness, like in the example of Aristotle. Because if you've got Aristotle saying, okay, women own 2/5 of the land, but you've got Xenophon saying they own 1/10. Okay, well, then it's just a factual discrepancy. And if, let's say, Aristotle, we don't know Aristotle's a misogynist, we've got no idea, well, then it's just two conflicting sources, and we've got no way to determine which one is correct, which one we trust more. So, the bias can be a good thing because it does tell us that Aristotle may have been exaggerating. He may have been overstating the land ownership attributed to women as a way of sort of asserting the superiority of Athens over Sparta. So, this is a really important point. Try not to make generalized statements in your responses. Generalizations kill essays. Generalizations kill your short answers. You need to be specific. You need to give me specific examples. You need to tell me in relation to this exact source, this specific source, XYZ is true. Okay? And we will get into some examples of this. And then instead of bias, you can use these terms of underlying ideology or underlying political agenda or personal prejudice or personal perspectives or XYZ. There are so many different things you can throw in there, but be specific. Tell me what is inherently unreliable or what is affecting the factual reliability or the usefulness of this source. What is something that we need to keep in mind when using this source? So, I've only been referring to ancient historians. I've been saying just ancient historians, yep, Aristotle's biased, Xenophon's biased, they're all biased. Modern historians can be as well. And I think something that a lot of ancient history students neglect are modern historians. Although it is the study of ancient history, it is not the study of ancient historians. We're not only using ancient sources here, we're using modern sources as well. You guys study in your Pompeii and Herculaneum unit, you study modern technologies, you study modern perspectives. I know a lot of you guys will be using the Pompeii movie as your modern representation, or one of the modern paintings from the 1850s, or even the song Pompeii. I know a lot of people in my HSC cohort use the song Pompeii. There are a whole range of sources that need to be considered in this study and in all of your units, and using different sources really sets you apart. Those of you aiming for the Band 5, Band 6 won't achieve those levels by singularly using ancient sources. And I know that might sound a bit daunting, but you'll find that when you look through past questions, let's say the personality study, when I was studying for my Julius Caesar questions, a majority of the questions used a modern source as the stimulus. We had to refer to that modern source, and it's quite difficult to refer to a modern source if on its own in its in confinement, that just that modern source, if you've only got ancient sources, because then you have to try and relate the two on the fly. If you've got additional modern sources, you can contrast this source with that source. And that is a real band six sort of quality, being able to pit one source against another, saying this source says this source says this. I think this one is right, or this one is right because of these factors, and all of these factors that we've just discussed, the different reliability criteria, the different things that go into making a source that we want to use. So, is hindsight a benefit? So hindsight being the ability to look back, like historians do, it's their entire job. Is it a benefit, or is it just another form of bias? Because we are in this modern time, is it a gift to be able to look backwards, or is it a curse? Can we impose our modern ideals and our modern perspectives on the past? Like, let's go back to this example of Aristotle. Can we impose our gender equality perspectives on that time to judge the society, or to judge Aristotle, to say that he's a misogynist and what he's saying is wrong? Can we do that? These are questions that we need to consider. So you can see and analyze the event in its totality, allowing you to consider different factors. And you'll find that especially with your period study. The period study, looking at a specific time, a time span in history, you're able to see a sort of evolution. This event led to this event, and this led to X, Y, Z. When I studied the fall of the Roman Republic, it's this led to this, and this led to this, and that caused the fall of the Republic. But different historians disagreed. Some modern historians said, well, no, it was this event that marked it. This event, it was Julius Caesar crossing the Rubicon that marked the end of the Republic. But then it was some people saying, well, no, it wasn't Caesar crossing the Rubicon. It was the formation of the Second Triumvirate. And some people say it was way earlier when Sulla and Marius went to war, the first major civil conflict in the Roman Republic. Each historian has different perspectives, and they have reasons for those perspectives. We are able to compare them, to contrast them, to state in our essay that we prefer this perspective. Why? We have to explain it. Then you've got your cons. You've got the removed perspective. We are not living in that time. We don't have the same perspectives as the people who lived at that time. And we have a tendency, or rather modern historians in general, have a tendency to view events as like inevitable. It was bound to happen. Well, in that moment, it wasn't bound to happen. There were a lot of things that were just split-second decisions. One person decided to make this decision, which led to all these different events. It's not something that was bound to happen or inevitable. Like, historians will reference the fall of the Roman Republic as an inevitable thing. It was gonna fall one day. Well, we can see that if this didn't happen, if this person didn't do this, if these factors hadn't played together, well then, it may not have happened. It's not as inevitable as some historians make it out to be. They over-dramatize the history of it. And I find when watching some documentaries that can be the case. They're very much playing it up. Now, I know this might be a bit boring, guys. You guys might not be the big history buffs, but these skills are very, very important. Now, you've also got an over-reliance on sources. So, I like that little quote there. Ancient history is one grand game of Chinese whispers. And we've been playing it for thousands of years. And I don't know if you guys have tried to play this game before, and I don't know if that term is still appropriate, Chinese whispers, but secrets being passed or words being spoken will always evolve. Spoken stories will always change. My grandfather tells lots of stories, and sometimes when we hear that story for a second time, there's a few differences, a few embellishments here and there. But that's what happens. The more something is told, the more grand it becomes, the more the details start to change. So different ancient writers' views are projected as fact because they were the only surviving accounts. So we've got Pliny the Younger there as that example. He was the only one to write about the actual eruption of Vesuvius. Pliny the Elder, not so much in this instance, but his natural history describing the region of Campania before the eruption of Vesuvius is taken as fact. Sure, we have evidence to corroborate, and we can use the modern technologies that we have to corroborate what he's saying. But prior to all of that being corroborated, we took what he wrote as fact. Pre-eruption, Campania was amazing. Well, we didn't entirely know that. We know that from today, but 2,000 years ago, Campania would have been a completely different landscape. Another one, these archaeological sources, these written sources are not the only ones that are unreliable. Ancient ones, archaeological sources, our physical sources, are also not free from bias and free from unreliability. It's very easy to assume that they're the only objective sources, the only ones that are built into fact. But we've got to remember, it's people behind these sources. People are not only creating, but affecting, interacting with these sources, with these artifacts. So who is funding the creation of these things? When we're looking at that statue of Marcus Nonius Balbus, it's the people in Herculaneum who are projecting this image of this guy. Or it's he himself who's funded his own statue. It's pretty awesome, I must admit. I want to have a statue of myself in my house. It's pretty cool. But you have to look at, if you're building a statue of yourself in your house, like I will one day, do I want to make myself look awesome in military gear riding a horse, or do I want to make myself working behind a desk like I do every day? Well, obviously, I want to be riding into battle. You've got to consider this. So the artwork specifically, we've got a lot of history surrounding paintings being inaccurate, and my mind always jumps to, I saw a TikTok on this the other day, Henry VIII and one of his wives, I think it was Anne of Cleves, who he saw a picture of her and he was in love, he was infatuated, and when she came from Germany and he met her, he was very disappointed with what he saw, which is just horrible, and he was a horrible person, but it's funny because images can be deceiving. So, and you've got this picture up here, this statue of Augustus, who's meant to be 50 years old. And at this point, if I do recall correctly, we have sources stating that he had severe physical disabilities by this point. And he's standing there with a six-pack of abs and standing very, very Statue of Liberty-like. Is it accurate? Well, if we're taking archaeological sources at face value, then yeah, definitely it's accurate. So, now to applying all of this. I know I've yapped a little bit about all of that sort of stuff, and I don't want to bore you guys, even though I may have already. But we've looked at the syllabus. We've looked at what sort of sources we need. We looked at how we're going to start viewing sources, and now we need to apply all of that. So that first core study, Pompeii and Herculaneum, you're going to need sources from both Pompeii and Herculaneum. And that meme has been going around for years of people just taking sources from Pompeii, just writing about Pompeii, just neglecting Herculaneum completely, not writing about it, not talking about it. And it's an issue because even if your question doesn't directly state Herculaneum or Pompeii, it is expected that you have a range of sources. And a lot of time that'll be on the marking criteria, a range of sources. If you've got sources, only written sources, only from Pompeii, it's like, well, you're limiting yourself. We want archaeological sources. We want sources from Herculaneum. Some of the better sources for a lot of these questions are from Herculaneum. Better preserved, specifically some of our villas and whatnot. Villa of the Papyri is in Herculaneum, and we've gone so far as recreating it or being very heavily inspired by the Villa of the Papyri for the Getty Villa in I think it's Los Angeles, which I'm very excited to visit very soon. It's a recreation, which is awesome. So you have to use both Pompeii and Herculaneum as your evidence. You can't just use one. And beyond that point of just Pompeii and Herculaneum. On a more general note, you want at least one source for each syllabus point. And so we looked at the syllabus before and saw it had, like, for example, the economy, and it had trade, commerce, the role of the forum, etc., etc., etc. You will need a source, or you need to know a source that links to each one of those listed points. So the role of the forum, you're going to need sources. Role of the forum is quite an easy syllabus point because it's the role of the forum. Just know the layout of the forum, or know some buildings in the forum. Let's say you know that. I'm trying to remember now. So some of the temples, I think the Temple of Zeus is in the forum. This is a long time ago that I did Pompeii and Herculaneum, guys. I'm talking like a year and a half, 2 years ago. Um, that doubles as a source for when you look at religion, or the Temple of Isis being outside of the forum. It's for religion, it's for forum, it's for foreign cults as well. So find sources that mean multiple. That's the sort of main idea. Now, if we look at this source here, so the frieze of Dionysus, or the Dionysic frieze in the Villa of Mysteries in Pompeii. It's also quite good to just specify which city you're referring to when listing a source. It just shows that you sort of know what you're talking about. Okay, now back to the dreaded syllabus, as always. Should always be referring back. So, specifically that top section there, the investigating and interpreting the sources, you need to have sources for majority of those different things up there. So, in terms of the economy, you need to have sources for the role of the forum, trade, commerce, industries, occupations, but you'll find there'll be a lot of crossover. There'll be a lot of crossover between those points in the economy and the points in the social structure. Specifically, there's a lot of crossover between the social structure and local political life. This difference between the class system, so as in you've got freedmen being below those of like freeborn men, so men who were previously slaves, or people who were previously slaves, as opposed to people who were born free. There's a different social standing there. That leads into our local political life because some officers, some political officers, were limited just to people who were born free. And so then you've got this sort of interplay between those two sections, and you can have one source talking about or indicating things about both of them. So if you get a question on one, you can use that source, and if you get a question on the other, you can also use that source. Sort of doubling up, limiting your study. And so one that comes to mind in that specific example is the idea that if someone wants to be one of the decuriones, they have to have been freeborn. And so a lot of the time, if there is a freed slave, a freed man, who gets quite wealthy, because again, slaves could be quite wealthy. They could become so wealthy that they have their own slaves and land and whatnot. They would sponsor their child, a lot of the time their son, to run for political office because their son, or well, in this instance, son, would have been born free. So there's the sort of interplay between the two. You've also got the interplay between religion and the influence of Greek and Egyptian cultures, because if we've got that point on foreign cults and religions, it's sort of interplayed. A lot of the art and architecture we're going to refer to in that final syllabus point there is in our cults, our tombs and temples. If you look at the Temple of Isis, the Temple of Isis is dedicated to a foreign cult, a foreign goddess, an Egyptian goddess. Obviously, it's going to feature some Egyptian architecture. It links the points. That's the sort of thing. Knowing your syllabus is very important because it allows you to limit the amount of sources that you need to be able to skate through that first section. Okay, I know I yapped a little bit talking about the syllabus, but if we jump back to this Dionysiac frieze, sorry, let's try again, Dionysiac frieze, the frieze of Dionysus, it links to every single one of these different points. Foreign cults, the influence of Greek culture on art, architecture, and religion. And this is a clip of an older syllabus, but again, same sort of points. This is to indicate to you that not only can you use questions from the previous syllabus section because it is very, very similar. So you've got a wider range of practice questions. But it's also the idea that one source, one singular source, can link to a whole range of different sections. And this very much will limit your study. It'll limit how much you need to memorize because it is a very content heavy subject. Now, I've mentioned this, I've alluded to this. The key to having sources ready for anything and to be prepared for your source analysis section is finding sources that cover multiple dot points. And it's simple as that. And I know I may be oversimplifying, but if you can accurately backwards map a source and say, okay, I've got this source and it's a fairly strong source, I can link it to this, this, and this. Well, then you've just crossed off those things on the syllabus. And of course, it is better to have multiple sources for everything. You want to have a whole range of sources. Because what if you have a 6 or 7 mark question? You're not just going to use one source. That's when you're going to need a bit more of a depth of understanding and a depth of examples. But at the bare minimum, you want one source at least for each point. Now, we've got more examples here. This is the statue of Marcus Nonius Balbus that I've been constantly referring to in Herculaneum. And this links to a whole range of different dot points. It has an inscription stating that it is a statue of Marcus Nonius Balbus, the patron of Herculaneum and the senator, and la 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 la, listing all his accomplishments. And obviously, it's a statue, but it links to our social structure with men being given statues. You'd be very, very hard pressed to find a statue of a woman in Herculaneum or Pompeii that has survived to this day, because again, there's that social structure. There's the limitations imposed based on gender. It links to your local political life, because in terms of local political life, you've got the different magistracies, being your decuriones and whatnot, but you've also got that senatorial class, the class who don't necessarily participate in the political happenings of Pompeii and Herculaneum as cities, but have a significant amount of influence because of their political standing as, let's say, senators or governors of different regions, or family members of, at this point, we're looking at what, 79 AD, Roman emperors. You've got a whole range of different things to consider here. So when we look at the Villa of the Papyri, which is up in the top corner over here, that was owned, or that villa was said to have been owned by the father-in-law or the uncle, I slipped my mind, of Julius Caesar, who again would have had a considerable amount of influence based on his connections. So it links to clothing because it's indicating what likely these people would have worn. And although in a statue we again come back to that reliability side of it and how useful is this source, not every day would someone have been wearing full military attire, wearing their armor and whatnot. Quite rare, especially somewhere as central as like Campania, the cities in Vesuvius, or the cities of Vesuvius that we're studying. There was no battlefronts. It was very, very safely seated within the boot of Italy and within the wider empire at this point. So not every, but again, even though the source may not be factually evident about what everyday clothing would have looked like, it tells us what it wouldn't have looked like, which still means it's a useful source. Then we've got a Temple of Isis, and I've mentioned the Temple of Isis quite a bit as well, as linking to your foreign cults, your household gods, the influence of the Greek and Egyptian cultures. Again, we're using the older syllabus here just to indicate that the fact that you can use both. You can use the older one, take it with a grain of salt, use a bit of common sense to see, okay, is this still applicable? But you've got more questions to draw from. The social structure, women, men, freedmen, slaves, the idea that this was outside of the main forum in Pompeii, yet it was still significant. It is an example of a public building, so a building that would have been financed and maintained by the city, by the different magistrates who were in charge of administrating the administrative happenings of the city. And it also links to the eruption because we can look at different ways that it was affected by the eruption. And there is specific evidence relating to that. As we can see, it's still somewhat standing. So that is another thing that we can analyze. And then linking to local political life, because religion and politics are, well, at this point, were inextricably linked. They didn't have a separation of church and state, a sort of secular society like we think we have today. It was different then. People needed to be seen as very pious to be able to gain these political offices. And then we've got the Villa of the Papyri, which was one of my favourite sources to use because I'm a big Caesar fan, and this is linked to Caesar. Um, but this is an example of a building, and it also links to our ideas of private buildings. It was a villa. It was privately owned. You can also link this to the later sections of your syllabus where we start to look at the reconstruction and conserving of history, because if I remember correctly, in the Villa of the Papyri, and this is a photo of the Getty Villa in LA, the recreation, but the actual Villa of the Papyri, there is a project, I think it's called the Nicodemus Project, or the I'm going to find out. It's a project where they're trying to conserve or bring back some of the papyri, the scrolls, which were found in that villa, and trying to interpret the sources. They're using artificial intelligence, they're using X-rays and CT scans, and you'd think X-rays and CT scans on a bunch of scrolls is a bit of a strange use, but it's creative. This is what we've come to in terms of modern archaeology. We're using the technology we have at hand to find out all of these different things. It links to the influence of Greek and Egyptian cultures through art and architecture. If you look at the styling of the statues, there would have been influence from those cultures. And then quite a big thing, and it's got it listed down as the private buildings. I think in the new syllabus it's a bit different, where we look at the features of a house. The names are slipping my mind, but you've got the atrium and different things like that, where portions of a house there's just no roof, or the peristyle, and different sort of features that we've got to consider in terms of the sizing of houses and what they would have looked like. Whether this is a villa rustica, whether it operated as a farm as well as just a rural villa. Lots of different questions to consider, but it's something that we can use as a source for a whole range of things. And again, to this social structure, because this person would have been very, very, very rich. So can we use it as a source to indicate the lives of all people? No. Can we indicate it as a source of the life of the quite wealthy? Yeah, of course. What their lives might have looked like, what their properties might have looked like. Now, we're at the end of skill 1. Everyone go take a break, have a breather. That was the largest section. That was really the underlying skill of ancient history. If you can do everything that we've gone through in that section, you're covered. You're sweet in terms of your understanding. Now it's just about conveying that understanding to the marker. And how do we do that? We do that through the medium of short answer extended responses. Okay? So everyone go have a breather. I'm going to go find out what that project is called. Okay, so I had a look and I found out it was called the Philodemus Project. So it is good sometimes to have just these sort of examples that you can just jump to and from when in need. Philodemus Project, like I described, they're using CT um, and X-rays and AI technologies to try and decipher what these 2,000-year-old scrolls actually said. So it's pretty cool, and it's called the Philodemus Project, I believe, because um, one of or some of the scrolls contain the writings of an ancient writer named Philodemus. So a little bit of trivia for you there. Um, these sort of things are really important to just have in the back of your mind, so when you need them, you've got them. So our short answer responses, the application. As we've discussed, this makes up 50% of your HSC paper. It is very, very important to nail these skills from now. So they can range from anywhere between 1 to 8 marks. There can sometimes be 9 to 15 markers in these first two sections, but we don't really consider them short answer. We consider them extended responses. They are like a mini essay. So right now we're just going to focus on the short answers, the 1 to 8 markers, um, no, around those numbers. So a lot of people think the short answers are easy. That's not entirely correct. They might be faster, they might require a little bit less energy, and they're a little bit less arduous as opposed to an essay where you're sitting writing 6, 7 pages. Um, but they're not easy by any means. And there is quite a skill to getting short answers down pat. So some people believe that it is easier to lose marks in short answer than it is in an essay, and I completely agree. Writing a good essay and writing good short answers are two very different things. I think the short answers are more difficult. So it is easier to lose marks in short answer. There is more for them to assess you on in terms of the specifics. There's less space. With an essay, they've got a larger sample size. They're looking over, they being the markers, are looking over multiple pages worth of writing, and they're having to assign a mark to it. So a good essay, being a 20 or 21 out of 25, gets you 84%, approximately. Whereas getting 18 out of 25 in your short answers, which is just losing 1 or 2 marks for every question, which if you're consistently losing 1 or 2 marks, that leaves you with 72%. So that would be considered a good attempt, getting the band 3, 4, 5s in all of the questions, not hitting the band 6s, but nearly hitting those full marks, but not hitting the full marks. You lose more because there are more questions. So then we need to figure out how to structure them. The structure of your response in a short answer section is dependent on how many marks are allocated. If you have an 8 marker, obviously, and I shouldn't need to explain this to you, I think you all know this, an 8 marker has more writing than a 2 marker. There is a big difference in how much writing. The general rule of thumb is 2 lines per mark, approximately. And if you are provided with a set amount of lines for a question, best practice is to fill the lines. Fill out the lines as best you can, and they'll have no sort of reason to mark you down if you're hitting all the other points that we're going to talk about. So you don't want the one thing for you to be marked down on is not enough writing or not enough substance. That's just a silly reason to be marked down. So then you've also got the time allocation. This idea that each section in the HSC ancient paper you're given approximately 45 minutes for. Well, they tell you to budget 45 minutes for each. On the front of the paper, it'll say sections 1, 2, 3, 4, 45, 45 for each. Short answer, in my opinion, should give you a little bit of buffer room. If you get through your short answers in sections 1 and 2 done quickly, if you get through them quickly, you will have more time to work on your essays, to work on your personality study mini essays, the 10 and 15 markers, and your big 25 mark essay in your period study. It is a lot easier to smash out a 1 marker or a 2 marker in a minute than get 1 or 2 marks done in some of your other questions, 1 or 2 marks worth. Again, because you just get to the point, which we will cover. So, a very important idea, which is important across all your subjects. So I do want to spend a little bit of time on it because this will be very, very useful for all of your subjects. And it's the idea of the NESA verbs. And I would be a bit worried if you guys haven't heard of them by now. Your identify, describe, define, account for, assess, analyze, compare. All of these different verbs are absolutely integral to your answering of questions. Not only short answers, but also of extended responses. The question is essentially directing you into how you should be answering. It is telling you, this is what I'm looking for. I'm looking for a a response that's sketched in general terms about the topic of the question. And sketch in general terms is outline. Those sort of things. If we're talking about key characteristics and features, you're talking about describe. These verbs are very, very important. And if you have a question that's about explain, but you're only describing, there is 0% chance that you will get the marks, the full marks for that question. If you are not addressing the question, if you are not answering what it is asking, you will not get the marks. And that's quite disappointing because, as we've discussed, it is easier to lose marks here in the short answers than it is in the essays. And I'm not saying it's fine to use the wrong verb in your essays. No, try your hardest not to do that. But definitely keep this in mind. And when you read a question for the first time, highlight it. Highlight the verb, circle it, put the little definition there, just so every time you look back to the question, refer back to the question, that is your constant point of reference. Okay, this is an explained question. I'm going to relate cause and effect. I'm going to talk about this causational relationship, this causal relationship between the circumstances that I'm looking at, the factors that I'm considering. Okay? Now, these verbs aren't just fillers. Don't ignore them. And I think a particularly important point here is this idea of not assuming the marker knows, assuming the marker knows the story. With each subject, it can be a bit different. So this is specific to ancient history. We are assuming that every marker, even if they haven't taught these units, has a general idea of what we're saying. We do not need to spend time narrating the story. We're talking about Pompeii and Herculaneum, cities of Vesuvius. We're not going to spend time in a question about everyday life, talking about how everyday life was disrupted by the eruption in 78, and the eruption happened in 7 different stages. It's not needed. It's not needed, and we're assuming the marker knows what we're talking about. If you refer to the eruption in 78, the marker's going to know you're talking about the eruption of Vesuvius, and the marker's going to know that you are linking it to this thing for a reason, and you have to make that reason clear. But you don't need to tell the story of the eruption again. Okay? If the question is about explain the stages of the eruption, that's absolutely fine. Of course you're going to tell the story then. But in a question that's not asking you for the story, don't give the story. The markers have taught this. The markers know this content. They know the stories of what's happened. And everyone knows the story of Pompeii. Herculaneum is the quiet younger brother, but everyone knows about Pompeii and the eruption of Vesuvius. So you don't need to tell the story again. You've got the difference between your high order and low order verbs. Your high order being your evaluate, account for, discuss, explain, assess. Those sort of higher order verbs which are a bit more difficult, because they require a higher level of understanding and a higher level of attacking the question. You need to be looking at it from multiple perspectives. You need to take different things into account. And you need to make those things clear. Whereas if you're given an explain point, it's not as involved, the process of coming to that answer. You are giving me the cause, you're giving me the effect, and you're relating them. It's that simple. A describe, even easier. So be wary of this, where it sort of links to the points that I've mentioned earlier, where those low order verbs will be assigned to the low mark questions. Get through them quickly, but also keep the verb in mind. When you start to get to those higher order questions, higher marks, very much keep it in mind. That should be the forefront of your mind. Okay, this question is an evaluate. I need to evaluate. So the definitions for all these terms are available online. They're on NESA's website. They're at the front of every ATAR Notes study guide. They're available everywhere. But you need to know them, because I guarantee majority of the rest of the state knows them, because they're taught in every single subject, they're used in every single subject. They're very important to know. So now we're getting into structuring responses, specific responses, specific mark allocations. If we're talking about a 2 marker or 1 or 2 marker. These are the things you need to do, and we're going to go through all of them. Now, a 1 to 2 marker. Get to the point. Answer the question. Read the question, know what it's asking you, decipher, interpret it, whatever. Take what time you need to understand what it is asking, because a lot of the time people will lose marks here because they don't actually understand what the question's asking. Read the question, read it again, turn around, or don't turn around in your exams. Look up, come back down, read it one more time, know what it's asking you, then answer it. Don't overthink it. Don't try and write a 2-page plan, 1-page plan. You don't need to plan a 2-mark response. You can do a little mind map around the question if that works for you, but don't spend too much time on them. Get to the point. You don't need to give me a big fluffed about introduction. 1 mark, 1 sentence, and 1.5. It depends on the sort of question. Use your judgment, but no need to do the whole peel structure and all that sort of stuff. Answer the question. So a 3 to 5 marker, you need to be writing in full sentences. I personally would advise that a 1 to 2 mark question should also be written in full sentences. You don't know whether you're going to get a marker who prefers the full sentences or who doesn't mind. To be on the safe side, these are formal exams, so go with the full sentences, even if it's an identifier and you really, really, really just want to list. Try and avoid it if you can. Like if we jump back to this question here, identify the privileges of the 2 kings of Sparta. It makes sense to list. It makes a lot of sense to just list. And so those of you who have studied Sparta, you should know some privileges of the kings could include, and I would literally dot point them, being able to eat first at feasts, or that everyone stood when they entered the room, or that they were. It's been a while, guys. Give me a break. There's a whole and I would just dot point them, but to be on the safe side, and depending on your teacher's preferences, full sentences is the way to go. So, in a 1 to 2 marker, you do not need to give me context. There is no need. You're wasting your time. And time is very, very valuable, as you guys who have already done these longer sort of exams will know. Some context in a 3 to 5 marker is good. Don't go overboard. Don't drag it. 1 sentence at the very max. Then when it comes to sources, we've already discussed how to integrate sources, or like what we need to consider when choosing sources. Now we're looking at how many sources we need. At least 1 source per point. I want to make that clear. Per point, not per mark, not per question or per answer, per point. In a 3 to 5 mark question, if you are only making 1 point, you need at least 1 source. As you get closer to that 5 mark, you might be making more than 1 point. So you might need more than 1 source, at least. These are things to keep in mind. Have multiple sources ready. We've already discussed the key to having enough sources, being find the ones that really fit with lots of them. Now, your 6 to 8 markers, these are when they start to get a bit more difficult. This is where you definitely need more than 2 points, 3 points at least. And this is where you start having your short intros, your 1 to 2 sentence, maximum 2 sentences. I know I've got max in all caps there. Maximum 2 sentence intro on the 8 marker side, but they're short sentences. Describe what you're going to talk about, answer the question in that first sentence, provide your judgment, and then have multiple points, at least 1 source per point, at least, and that's the key words, and that's why it's bolded, at least 1 point, 1 source rather. This sets you apart. If you have a range of sources, if you've got contrasting sources, and I've mentioned that a few times now, and I want to actually talk about that a little bit. Contrasting sources are very much a band 6 characteristic. If you are able to look at 2 different sources and think, okay, these talk about different things, which one is correct, or how am I going to decide which one to use? that takes quite a complex level of thinking, and that's quite important to have. If you can find two historians or two sources, or a written source and an archaeological source, and compare them, or look at which one might be correct, or consider the implications of one on the other, that takes a smart student. That takes quite a bit of thinking. And if you want to impress your marker, you're going to do that. And my class, when we were doing our HSC, specifically for the personality study, and this is where it would really come in handy, as well as the period study. The period that we looked at it was a very tumultuous period, the fall of the Roman Republic. And there's been lots of different varying opinions on it. Some people think it never fell. Some people think that it fell at different times. And there's not many historians that agree on a specific time. And so that makes it very easy to contrast historians' opinions. Looking at the personality study, when I studied Julius Caesar was a very divisive figure. Some people loved him, some people hated him. It's very interesting to look at the way the different sources appreciate that individual. And this is where the skill comes in, comparing the way those different historians will consider the impact of that individual. Now, we're going to look at integrating these sources. So, for the core study, you'll be given your sources. Not all of them, though. You'll be given one source for each question, approximately. And as a source-based study, you need to be able to integrate, but also you need to be able to add others. So if the question is indicating using this source A, B, C, whatever it is, and other sources, and your own knowledge, it is absolutely necessary that you do use other sources and your own knowledge. Like you need to, and when I say your own knowledge, I'll get into that in a moment. You need to be able to think of what the question is asking, okay, understand that. Look at the source that you're provided. What can this source help me, or how can this source help me in answering the question? And from there, you have to consider how your own knowledge or how an additional source could come into that. All right, so there's a big difference between effective integration and just quoting the source. So it's important to understand that distinction. Effective integration has two main features, that it's explicit and that it's analytical. Quoting the source is it is explicit, it's very explicit, but it's not analytical. Quoting it is just throwing it in, slabbing the quote, just putting the whole slab of quote in there. It doesn't do anything for you. Yes, you'll tick off the box on the marking criteria that you've used the source, but that's in the D level, E level. You haven't integrated the source. Integrating the source could be breaking up the source into lots of different little quotes that you can throw into your sentences that will support your argument. And that's another point, actually having an argument for that quote to latch onto, to be included in. And then you've also got this analytical side where you're not telling me the story. Sometimes quotes will tell a story. If we go back to our Aristotle example, Aristotle would tell the story that women own too much land, according to him. You don't need to restate that. What you need to look into is this idea that Aristotle's view that women own too much land indicates X, Y, Z, which links to my argument. Tell me what the argument is. Well, you should have already stated that in your first sentence, but still, tell me, is there bias? Is there those different inherent biases, political factors? Is the source corroborated? There's that point that I was just mentioning about conflicting historical opinions. That really levels up your writing. How do modern historians play into it? Are there factual errors in the source? Are there factual errors in sources that you have? that link to the same sort of ideas of the provided source. Analyze. Really, really analyze. You've got to look back to your year 7 history where you looked into primary and secondary sources, all that sort of stuff. Tell me the drawbacks of the source. Tell me the strengths of the source. And tell me how that leads into your argument, how that either supports or subtracts from your argument. And then you've got that explicit part where, yes, quoting a source is very explicit, but we don't want slab. We want shorter, snappy extracts from a quote. And then if a source is labeled, source A, source B, source C, indicate it, underline it. It is source A. I have met what the criteria is saying, and I'm making it very, very clear for the marker to see. Underline it, absolutely. So, we've got this example here. This is a source from Sparta, and again, I'm very, very sorry to those of you who haven't studied Sparta. I don't think there will be many of you, but for those who are included in that, I do apologize. But the skills transfer. It's the exact same for whatever society study you're doing, and for all of the topics, all of the sections of the HSC paper. So in this instance, you've got two means of integrating this source. First one, which is the big red no. Source A is a photograph of a Spartan cup featuring hunters chasing the Caledonian boar. The artist used red and black paint and a two-dimensional artistic style. That is very, very, very descriptive. If we go back, it says it. I've put it very clearly. Is analytical, not descriptive. The last time I checked, the markers know what the source is. They've looked at it. They can see it. They can tell what it is. They've read 20 responses before yours that have described it. Be the one that doesn't describe. Don't waste your time. The marker can see it. If you've referred to source A, great. If it's a source that is not explicitly provided, you might want to tell me what the source is. But the second one does that as well. The big green yes. The image of the hunters chasing the Caledonian boar in source A. Let's say it's not a provided source. How would you go about that? Well, you would say something along the lines of the image of the hunters chasing the Caledonian boar in the ancient Spartan cup, or in an ancient Spartan cup recovered from Lacedaemonia in the 18th century. Same sort of thing. You just give me a little bit more context about where that source came from. So the image of the hunters chasing the Caledonian boar in source A is evidence for the significance of hunting in Sparta. Pause there. It's already linked it to an argument. And we'll continue. As not only a leisure activity that corroborated with their militaristic Spartan lifestyle, but also as a way of producing food, with a wild boar being a popular meal of choice. This has not only explained and analysed, it's linked to what the source is telling us, the implications of the source, and the different syllabus points that this would lead to. And this comes back to the idea that if you have less sources, or rather, if you have better sources, you will need less of them, because they cover multiple points. This one cup covers the point of Spartan lifestyle, links to the militaristic lifestyle, everyday life, food, all that sort of stuff. Now, this is a source communal to everyone, so no one will be grumpy. Integrating your own knowledge is very, very important. You will be asked quite often to using source A and your own knowledge, using source Z and your own knowledge. Well, we've got to understand what this own knowledge means. This own knowledge is not context to tell me the story. Own knowledge here refers to other sources. Sources that you know of, sources that you have studied, sources that you've analysed, sources that you think are important and work well here. So there's a difference between NESA stating, or rather asking you to use other sources, and using your own knowledge. Using your own knowledge, it has a little bit more weight to it because they're testing your judgment, really. They're testing how well you know your syllabus and how well you know how different things can link together. And the syllabus can be like a very complex web sometimes for the different units, where everything is sort of linked. Political life and social life linked. Um, Gender and politics linked. Gender and religion linked. Religion and politics linked. It's a big web. Um, so it's very easy to over rely on some sources and not your own knowledge. Well, your own knowledge is important here. So we sometimes will use the term springboarding. It is a very easy way to jump from the prescribed source to your own knowledge or to additional sources. You use the prescribed source as your basis to answer your question, affirm your argument, establish your argument, um, and then we lead to the next steps. And those next steps are linking to other points. So this example here, this is the Temple of Isis. We've mentioned it a few times now. The question here is describe the importance of foreign cults in Pompeii, specifically Pompeii. Now here, the prescribed source is the Temple of Isis. For those people who know their content, foreign cults, well, there are two main foreign cults that we study. The first one being the cult of Isis, and the second one being the cult of Dionysus. Remember, Pompeii and Herculaneum are Roman cities, Roman towns. Dionysus is a Greek god. There is the Roman version, Bacchus, who we see in one of the paintings on the walls where Bacchus is standing on Vesuvius. But here, Dionysus is the Greek version of that god, or the ancient Greek version of that god. So we need to springboard from talking about Temple of Isis and the cult of Isis to looking at a source that will inform us or be able to link to the cult of Dionysus. We have actually looked at a source already in this lecture, and that would be that Dionysiac frieze. I think I have it on one of these slides. I don't have it on one of these slides, but it's that big red painting on the wall which has Dionysus on there. And so that is how you would springboard. You would go from talking about the Temple of Isis and the cult of Isis, then leading into something else. So, in that example, we could say, as shown in source A, and it's not underlined there, that's missing, underline it. A picture of the Temple of Isis, foreign cults such as the Egyptian cult of Isis were very important to people in Pompeii, so much so that the Temple of Isis was rebuilt after the earthquake of 62 AD. Similarly, the cult of Dionysus was also influential given its strong connection to the popular wine industry, as evidenced by their depicting in the Dionysiac frieze. When you're planning your response, use this structure. So, establish your part one, your first part, what can I tell just from this prescribed text? And then find your second source, jump to it, and you'll be able to link it with a very strong point. So we've got like a 3-step process here. Firstly, it's like understanding the syllabus and the question. Work out what aspects of the question or syllabus relate to the prescribed source. It's about deciphering the source, knowing how or what you're going to get out of this source in relation to this question. But then also looking at working out how the prescribed source relates to other sources or issues within that question. And then working out what other areas of the question are not addressed by that source. Sometimes the source they will give you will not always cover everything. They can't expect one source to cover an entire syllabus point if the question's on the whole syllabus point. Let's say with that cults thing, that cults question, the Temple of Isis is not the only indicator of cults, foreign cults rather, in Pompeii. You also had the cult of Dionysus, but that source was not enough to cover everything. So we need to figure out what the source that we were provided with is missing and what the question has a bit more room for. So that brings us to the end of skill 2 being our short answer section. Short answers are important because, again, a lot of your exam will be based on short answers, and a lot of these skills are quite transferable to other subjects as well. For those of you who do modern history, your short answers there will be structured relatively similarly. Similarly, so yes, everyone go take a breather, and we'll come back and do our skill 3, which is extended responses and essays. All right, so we're going to start off, which is quite logical, with writing a thesis. It's the start of your essay. It is your first sentence in your introduction. It's the overarching argument. So a lot of the time when you're writing an at-home essay, your teacher will say, write your introduction last. Write your introduction and your conclusion last. You write your body paragraphs first and go from there. You don't have that luxury in an exam. Unfortunately, you can't really work backwards. So what you'd have to do is plan. Essays should be planned. Anything above 10 marks, in my eyes, warrants a plan. You can use the scrap paper. You can ask for scrap paper. You can use the spare spaces in the writing book, not writing book, sorry, in the question book. There's always room. There's always space to jot down a plan because I think there's a very clear distinction. I can even tell from my own writing. When I write or when I have written an essay without planning and with planning, there's a big difference in terms of my cohesiveness and the logic in what I'm trying to argue. Because at the end of the day, the essay is arguing something. Your thesis needs to encapsulate that whole argument. So it is a complete sentence that contains one main idea that controls the entire essay. And that's the idea. It controls the essay. The essay needs to link to those ideas. Now, the markers are looking for strong judgments and evidence that you can think critically about what you've learned. Your thesis needs to cover the entire question, and it's not you rephrasing the question, because that is a very simple way to do it. That's a very, very basic way. We don't want to just rephrase the question. We want to interpret the question and what the question might be alluding to. And even further than that, we want to actually give an answer that is not a direct answer. And I know this is confusing, but we're making our argument clear. Once you have figured out what you want to write for each of your body paragraphs, you need to be able to pull out a central line of argument. For those of you who've done debating, you would have a team line that kept getting repeated. Think of your thesis similar to that. It is that central point in your argument that all the other points are based off. So it should be a strong judgment. Majority of your essay questions will be those higher order verbs, so you will be able to use judgments in them. And it provides your essay with a sense of direction. Who to talk about and what can be ignored. Sorry, what to talk about and what can be ignored. So it'll help you in deciding which sources are necessary. So maybe it's easy to think about all that they care about is memorization, but at the end of the day, history is all about arguments. I completely agree with that. History is subjective. And for those of you who are very math, science based, those quantitative based subjects, I'm sorry that you have to live with that. History is not an exact science. It's a humanities subject for a reason. There is a lot of argument around what is history, and no one agrees. It's a part of the human condition to just not agree on these sort of things. So we need to make our evidence clear. We need to make our argument clear, and we need to have evidence to back it up. So a thesis statement must contain a subject and an opinion. The subject will be dictated by the question. Yes, the question will always refer to a part of the syllabus, or it could be a few syllabus points. It could be a whole section. It could be a whole range of things. Also, I love how that's just like screaming on top of me. I'm not screaming at you guys, I promise. The opinion may be directed by the question, but at the end of the day, it's yours to make. A lot of the time, your opinion will be informed by the historians you've studied. Me personally, I always found that modern historians guided my thinking because modern historians have the same sort of sources that we do. They have access to everything that we have access to, and they've come to those conclusions, and they know quite a bit more about history than I do. I'm going to trust their judgment. However, a lot of the time there will be different modern historians, like we've discussed, with differing views, and this is where we get our extra marks. I will refer to multiple different historians. Adrian Goldsworthy thinks this, Dexter Hoyos thinks this, all these different historians you can refer to. Mary Beard writes this. Lots of different historians that you can contrast with each other. And the funny thing is, a lot of the times they will have debates. You can find on in lots of documentaries and videos these historians having debates about these things, and you can grab some awesome points there. So, although a thesis statement is an opinion, it is not a personal statement. It is not a I, we, I believe. No, you need to be using language that is formal, academic. It is clear, it is evident. Um, One can be led to the conclusion that this. Um, and again, we don't like narratives. We've discussed this. Narratives are not good. The study of history is not about narratives, not about telling a story. So, one of the most common bits of negative feedback people receive is that it is too descriptive or too narrative. My teacher hated when we used to be too narrative based and telling the story. My teacher was a big history buff. Of course, he knew the stories. He'd been telling us the stories since we were in year seven. You really need to keep that in mind that the teachers know the stories. And even if they don't, that's not really what they're looking for. They're looking for your ability to analyze the sources, integrate the sources, make an argument, and link that argument with those sources. They are the points you're trying to make. So you've been taught to see history as a chronological thing, a thing that's a series of events. But this is not how we want to be answering our responses. So I found a lot of the time my classmates, specifically when looking at the period study, they would write it as like a chronological recount. We don't want that. The chronological recount gets you nowhere. You're not getting any marks because of it. We're sure it might be great to talk about specific examples of things with or different events within that period study, and if they're in chronological order or not, that's fine. Um, but you're not here to tell me the story. You're not here to tell your markers the story. You're here to tell them what you think about different things in relation to what the question's asking. What is your argument about what the question is asking? So don't don't write a chronology. Don't give me a recount. Don't write a narrative. And there's something called the meanwhile test. So if you could add meanwhile between two of your sentences and it still makes sense, you've got too much narrative. You're telling a story. Don't use meanwhile. Don't tell a story. Um, so again, comes back to that memorization point. We're not here to test memory. That's not what the point of this course is. The point of the course is to see your skills of evaluation and assessment, and being able to put together a strong, coherent, logical argument based on the evidence provided or the evidence that you've acquired. So the markers want to see or that you understand what the content is, and being able to put that content with the question, link to sources, la 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 la. So narratives don't answer the question. Narratives might allude to something on the syllabus. They might list what happened, but it's not analytical at all. Now, like we did with our short answers, expect a few essays. You're going to have quite a few of them. Don't walk into the HSC thinking, oh, but I hope this year we don't get an essay. It doesn't work like that. You will get an essay. You will definitely get essays. So in section one, that 10 marker, you will always get it's either an 8 marker, 10 marker, 12 marker on that reconstructing, conserving the past syllabus section in Pompeii and Herculaneum. You'll usually be given two sources, and that one is really big on looking at those different archaeological developments. You won't necessarily be looking at sources just as much. You'll be looking more at those different modern methods, how Pompeii and Herculaneum have been conserved over time, how there's been issues, the issues of tourism, ethical issues around like conservation, destruction, archaeology, because archaeology in itself is a destructive art. We are taking things out of where they are in situ. We are removing them from their natural place. So these are all things you need to consider, and the sort of structure of this would be very similar to the other essay structures we're about to talk about. You are looking at having a mini introduction, one or two body paragraphs. In this instance, I'd go two, or you could just do one big slab, having them combined. A lot of markers prefer a little bit more of a formatted, structured response in something that's 10 and above. At least two paragraphs and a little conclusion. Your intro and conclusion don't need to be more than two sentences each, but it's about having that structure there and making that a clear, delineable structure. Okay, he's done his introduction here. He's done his first paragraph here. She's done her second body paragraph here, and she's done the conclusion there. that sort of stuff, making it very clear for the marker you're beyond reproach. They can't mark you down for not having a clear structure. Then you've got in section 2 a 15 marker extended marker. 15 mark extended response. So it's usually phrased, I'm not to say always, because I don't want to lull you into a false sense of security. What does evidence reveal about this? Or in your answer, use this to indicate this. And this is your society study, and the society study is less based on historiography and archaeology and methods of conservation, more on the actual happenings of that society. So this is a bit more content based, a bit more source based. You need sources to be able to answer this, and it'll be quite difficult to answer a 15 mark question with only a few sources, and you're only going to be given one or two. So be very, very weary, usually one actually, be very, very weary about not having enough sources specifically for that section. So the question is literally on evidence. It is also imperative that you support your arguments with a range of evidence. Um, so here, same sort of thing. Your intro, have a very strong thesis, that very strong argument point. 2 paragraphs, possibly even 3. Um, Obviously, if you're doing 3 paragraphs, they won't be as long. If you're doing 2 paragraphs, they should be quite a bit longer. Um, but I've found in my experience that in ancient, we don't like to go too long with our paragraphs. Shorter paragraphs aren't a bad thing. Concise, get to the point. Not all ancient history teachers are yappers like I am, so you won't always find that writing of too much is well received. So then your section 3, your personality study, is usually split into a 10 and 15 marker. Sometimes it's a 12 and 17 or whatever it is. Or I think one year they did 5, 10, 10. So the first one, that 10 marker, is usually descriptive. So again, where you'll need sources to describe something, not very analytical. You won't require that much thinking. You're sort of not necessarily telling the story, but providing the context. And making a little bit of a judgment, but not necessarily analyzing sources. Part B then would be like an actual essay, 15 marks, with a little bit more depth to it, and a little bit more analytical. Section 25, Section 4, the 25 marker is exactly what we've spoken about up until this point. It is very much so an essay. It is a solid introduction. Get to the point. Don't have your intro too long. A big mistake that a lot of people make is a long intro. This is not English where you need to do a long intro. Introduce each of your points, have your thesis up there first, make your argument very clear, interpret the question, give me a little bit of context, but then move on. Get into the crux of it, because you shouldn't be citing sources in your intro. You shouldn't be analyzing in your intro. You're introducing your points and you're moving on. Now, this is a quick game. We don't have much time left, but this is a quick game. Which of these theses or theses are the best? And I'll give you guys just a second to quickly read through those. And again, feel free to pause there. But it is very clear here that length and the complexity of a thesis does not make it better. Here, the first is actually the best, the shortest. Claudius was a highly effective princeps during the Julio-Claudian period. Simple as that. You might be better off saying, giving me a little bit of a reason. Claudius was a highly effective princeps during the Julio-Claudian period as a result of these factors, or X, Y, Z. But it's fine. You don't need to elaborate too much. And that second one is specifically horrible. It's just especially terrible. Again, context should not be in your thesis. Now, this is one that I wrote. Came straight from me in one of my HSC assessments. I had to really dig through the records for this one. The question we were given was evaluate the rise of Julius Caesar, his political and military achievements, his impact on the Roman Republic, and the factors leading to his downfall. Bit of a wordy question. If we go back here, this would be more your part A, your more descriptive sort of thing. This is less analytical. And my thesis was, by measuring Gaius Julius Caesar's success through the lens of his time, he can only be described as one of the most successful figures in Roman history. Simple as that. I've told you the context of my argument. I'm saying I'm going to say through the lens of his time, and I will elaborate on that in my next sentence. But it's I've said it's pretty clear he's one of the most successful figures in Roman history. It can't be argued. That's the point I'm making. Not much more than that. So yeah, with your thesis, keep it simple for your sake and the markers. No need to use the jargon, the extensive vocabularies. We know you guys have great vocabs. No need to flex them on your markers. Keep it simple. Make your judgment very clear. Make your argument very clear, and you'll be fine. So yes, don't use low modality language. Well, this could lead to this, or it can be seen. It is likely. You use a bit more. If you've proven something, be strong in your conviction. Be strong in the fact, or be confident in the fact that your argument makes sense. Use it. Of course, we don't want to be absolute and running pig-headed and say, well, my answer is the only right answer. We still have to, consider other arguments. But if you've justified your argument, you've given me reason, the marker is not going to mark you down just because they disagree with your argument. It's how well you're actually arguing it. So if your judgment was like that thesis there, Claudius was a highly effective princeps, you can provide nuance in your argument by saying in the next sentence or after the fact, though Claudius's acceptance of the imperial bureaucracy alienated the Senate further, the increasing role of the freedman within the administration greatly increased administrational efficiency. A bit wordy, but you get the point. You don't need to mention it all straight in your thesis. You can get to it later on. So, it's not enough to just have a judgment in your intro. You need to carry it through. In school, my teachers used to call it a top and tail, where you link back to your thesis at the start of the paragraph and at the end of the paragraph, but never anywhere within. You need to make sure you're doing that throughout, not just topping and tailing. Throughout your paragraphs, throughout your arguments, link back to your thesis, link back to that central argument. Okay. So the arguments you make in your paragraph should be working towards the goal of proving your thesis. That's a very, very important point. So it means that all content has to be relevant. You don't have to include everything. And I think that's an important point. Not everything you know needs to be included in an essay. It's not like the blurting study method where you just throw everything you know in there. It's not like that. You have to be judicious with the information and the sources that you select. So, bad essay. This is one that didn't have a plan. This is one that was not planned beforehand and was very rushed and sort of just figure it out as we go. And there's a good essay. It's very clear. Content, evidence, detail, give me some context, link it to your point, link it to your judgment. Simple as that. It's not as convoluted as whatever this is meant to be. And believe me, I've written essays exactly like this. One of my trials essays was let's just say it was that. All over the place, because I walked in and I didn't understand the question and I just wasn't feeling very confident. But then I learned from my mistakes at HSC. I didn't write a plan in that essay. Write a plan. Even if you don't know the content, if you don't understand the question, figure out what you can take from it and work from there. Now, a big thing that's important is some people flip-flop their judgment. So a good way to ensure that you're not flip-flopping your judgment is keep linking back to it. Very simply, everything I've just said here affirms the significance of this. The accuracy of this is further revealed is la 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 la. All of these sort of things are good ways of like signposting your argument. It's clear links here. Okay, I'm reading as a marker. All right. Well, he's constantly linking back. She's constantly linking back. They have a cohesive and logical judgment. Now, there's this point about quality over quantity, and this is something that a lot of people will be considering. In a 25-mark essay, you want at least 5 pages, at least. Aim for the 5-page mark. If you go above, wonderful. If you're below, keep writing, try your hardest. 4 marks for a 25-marker is not enough. It's not enough. You have ample time, well, you should have ample time if you've used the techniques that we've spoken about today. You should be fine. Now, on to our final section, how to study for ancient history. And I think a lot of you guys would very much relate to this one here, studying a few minutes every day as opposed to, 30 hours just before the exam. So I've always found the best way to study was discuss with my class, with my teachers, with my family, with my friends, all that sort of stuff. Discussing, sort of getting it out in the open. And like I said there, after you guys have probably noticed, after 2 hours of talking, I am a yapper. But it just helped to say things out loud, to get it out in the open, to sort of discuss things. And history is a very good discussion-based subject. So to be able to discuss things with people who know what you're talking about helps. The HSC is a team sport, like I said at the start. Help each other out, build each other up, give each other your notes. You've now gotten to the point where you're no longer in competition with one another in terms of your internal assessments, apart from the trials, but the better one of you does, the better all of you do. Just help each other out. And then work together on different answers. Review each other's answers. Send practice questions to your teachers. Then there's the question of notes or practice papers. Which one's better? Depends. Depends is the main answer. I wrote notes, but I started my notes from the start of the year. So you can't compare. To those of you who haven't written notes thus far, don't stress and try and write notes from now. There's no point. It doesn't make sense. It doesn't make sense 2 weeks out from trials to start and trying to cover 120 hours worth of content and put it into notes. No, spend that time covering the content. See what you need to understand, the gaps in your understanding, and go from there. Because writing notes takes forever, forever. And like I've mentioned throughout, there are resources that are readily available. You've got your textbooks, you've got the ATAR Note Study Guide, you've got these lectures, you've got your friends, your notes, your teachers' resources, all that sort of stuff that you would have worked throughout the year that you can refer back to. And you've got your syllabus. At the very basis, if you've got nothing else, you've got your syllabus. So definitely do practice papers. At this point, I would be doing as many practice papers as I can. There are patterns. There are very, very clear patterns in the HSC. Don't worry too much about patterns because I told myself that my extended response in my HSC, the 25 marker, was definitely not going to be on this one syllabus point. It was on the syllabus point. And yes, we had an option, but the other one was on the other syllabus point that I did not want it to be on. So you can't entirely base it off patterns, but the more practice you do, the more inclined you will be to be able to answer on the fly. And then in terms of study methods, these were the two main ones that worked for me. The blurt method, thinking of a heading or a syllabus point, writing every single thing I could about that point, everything I knew off the top of my head, anything I could sort of come up with to link to that, anything, and I'd write it down. And then I'd check my notes, or the ATAR Notes book, or my teacher's slides, or whatever it was, and I would see what I was missing, the gaps. And then I'd go fill in those gaps. And weirdly, you'd remember the things that you forgot. So a very good method. And then a good method I found at consolidating and like that final study run before the trial or before the exam, the traffic light method. So printing out your syllabus, 3 highlighters, red, green, yellow, like traffic lights. Jesus, I shouldn't have my license anymore. And you're going through and highlighting each syllabus point to your level of confidence. If you are not confident with that content, you obviously need to either learn it, revise it, start from scratch even, or you need to just write a practice response. Read some of your past practice responses, look through things that you've done and go from there. Okay, I always found that doing this, I did this before every exam, and it always helped me sort of de-stress because I'm like, okay, I know what I'm talking about. I know this content. I've covered it. Nothing can sort of surprise me. Okay. So then, you guys have trials coming up. Good luck. Mental health is important. Keep it in mind. Take care of yourselves. And remember, this is not the final boss. This is not the big baddie at the end of the movie. The HSC is coming up. Trials are just the last step on the process to get there. You'll be fine. And yeah, just take care of yourselves. It's a very stressful period. And remember, ancient history is great. It's a great subject, okay? So, key skills. We've got our sources. Super duper important. Analyze, integrate, talk about the reliability, factual reliability, the usefulness of a source. Even though a source might not be factual, it can still be useful. Short answers, get to the point. Don't give me a story. I don't need a bedtime story. Tell me the answer. With your essays, be logical. Make it make sense. Have an argument. Use sources. And then with our study tips, use the syllabus. The syllabus will be your best friend. And I know they say that a lot, but it really will be, okay? So the lecture will be available on YouTube. Rewatch it before your HSC if you need some tips and tricks. Good luck, everyone. You all got this. And yeah, let us know if you have any questions.